Welcome back to the Anti-Meta Club. This week's race C is unfortunately a race that we pretty much had just about 6 weeks ago, but we do have a new anti-meta that's kind of the opposite of the meta. Let's get into it. The anti-meta car of the week is the Porsche. Finally, I don't think I've ever used this as the anti-meta car because most of the time, if it's not the meta, it's just as good as the meta, or at least close. The Porsche is so nimble and has such incredible acceleration and grip coming out of corners that it is perfect for battling the meta car. I gotta take a second to thank our friend Goblin who actually made this livery for me. It's essentially the Rexy livery, but with my channel colors, and you can find it in the, wherever you find liveries. I cannot remember what it's called, but that place. So the meta car is so powerful, and I also ran out of time, and this car just isn't as great when it comes to time trial. The fastest one of these is 101, and I believe I'm the third fastest in 200th place, but fear not, the car is actually very good in the race, and I do think that there are a couple tenths left. I think I can actually probably get a 0.6 with this car. As you can see, the Genesis is also super good, so I didn't feel really comfortable using that as the anti-meta, but I think you're really going to like the Porsche when you spend some time getting used to it. Starting out all the way on the left next to the grass, as soon as you get to the end of the grass, you're going to move up onto the curb. You can use the area beyond, but I don't suggest it. You're going to stay on the curb, and you're going to brake right at or directly after the 100 meter board. Wait until after the 50 meter board to turn in, and this is going to seem counterintuitive, but you actually want to go directly over the yellow sausage curb right here. That actually makes it more stable, and you don't have to steer as much. You want to gently get on that throttle, and you can go all the way up onto that yellow sausage curb on the outside. If you go beyond that, you will get a penalty. Also, if you're too heavy on the throttle, it's going to make your car bounce more, so you've got to be really gentle. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. I like to completely avoid the curb, so I just align myself as close to it as I possibly can, and I'm going to brake right at the 100 meter board. This corner has an extremely late apex, and it's really important that you hit it late to make sure you avoid the high elevation part right before the apex. You'll see I wait until I'm all the way past the 50 meter board, and I'm trying to hit the apex right at that yellow sausage curb on the inside. The important thing here is you do not lose any traction as you get on the throttle. If you slide at all, it's going to cost you a lot because you're going both uphill and from a really slow speed, so losing any momentum is going to be disastrous. I don't like using the outside curb to brake here at all either, so make sure you align yourself next to it but not on it, and you're going to brake right before the 100 meter board. Turn in and keep a lot of pressure on the brake right at the 50 meter board. You're going to drop down to first gear before you get to the apex. You get to rotate, but then you want to get back up to second gear and back on that throttle early. You've got to be really gentle, of course, not to induce any kind of under or oversteer, but after it rotates, you should be able to get on the throttle and catch that grip. Moving to the right, look for the curb. You're going to go onto the curb but not past it just like T1, and right before the 50 meter board, you're going to hit the brakes. Immediately start trail braking and turning in. You want to get down to second gear and come all the way up on the curb. It's going to take some practice to figure out exactly when you can get on the throttle, but as you can see, the track kind of goes downhill. So if you're not really gentle on the throttle, you're going to lift the weight off the front and you're going to cause understeer. So just be very gentle on the throttle there. At the end of the curve, make sure your left tires are to the left of the white line, and right where these two white lines intersect is when you're going to hit the brakes. Brake very gently, downshift to second gear to get the car to rotate, and then continue steering as you shift back up to third gear and try to steer yourself all the way up on the curb as you get on the throttle. If you get on the throttle too heavily, just like that last left-hand turn, you're going to go all the way into the sand. It's all about really gentle throttle application. If you use the exit curbing here on the left, make sure you don't get lazy and drive past it onto the grass. Once again, beyond the grass, you're going to look for the curb, you're going to move all the way up on top of it, and you're going to look for this little fence right here. Right before that, you're going to hit the brakes. Once again, you're going to immediately downshift, trail brake all the way up onto this curb, and once again, you have to be very gentle on the throttle. As you can see, this is a downhill section, so if you get on that throttle too heavily, it's going to pull your nose off the ground. This braking zone is really tough because there's nothing super distinct, but approximately 3 of these triple white marks on the curbing or beyond the curbing, that's when you're going to start hitting the brakes while you're still all the way up on the curb like this. At the start of the grass on the left is when you're going to turn in, downshift to second gear, try to get as close to the apex, if not all the way up on that yellow sausage, and then back on the throttle. I actually like to stay in second gear. I think I lost a 1/10.5 by shifting early, but I was afraid that if I got on the throttle too heavily, it would make me understeer. So first things first, I want to talk about not using the area beyond the curb. You actually can, and it's not as bad as it used to be, but it will give you dirty tires just at least for the duration of this corner. It's going to cause you to slip, and you can actually use the fact that you have a wider radius to your advantage, but it's very difficult. Feel free to try it out, but I suggest staying on the curb initially. The other thing with that same specific corner and the final corner as well is they're very bumpy and they can upset the balance of your car really easily. It's important not to be fully off the throttle because of course that's going to be too slow, but if you give too much throttle, you're going to move too much weight to the back of the car in a car that already has a lot of weight at the back. If you move the weight to the back of the car either too quickly by getting on the throttle too heavily, or if there's just too much of it on the back, making the car unbalanced, what can happen is you're not going to have enough suspension travel and you can essentially bottom out. If you've ever just fully lost control on that curb because it just kind of feels like your suspension sent you in a random direction, it's probably because you bottomed out your suspension. Again, just like everything else, especially these corners where you're throttling out as you're going down a hill, it's just important to be very smooth on the throttle. You can be quick, but smooth is the key. Most curbs I completely avoid the curbing or the area beyond the curbing, but for this final section right here, you've got to go all the way out to maintain enough speed, and that does make it more difficult to line yourself up for the final corner. It'll seem obvious, but make sure you stay off the grass on the exit. I've actually ruined laps like that. For almost the entirety of my 5-hour stream today, I was convinced that the Z4 was going to be my anti-meta car. I still actually think it's probably equal to this car when it comes to potential for beating the meta. With that said, I don't think it has quite as much potential when it comes to qualifying, so those of you who want to set a better qualifying time with the anti-meta car are probably better off using the Porsche, and that's actually ultimately why I chose the Porsche over the Z4. I really wanted it to be the Z4, and I think I actually was driving better with the Z4, but the Porsche is superior, I think. At the very least in time trial, and at the very best, they are equal when it comes to the race pace. I mentioned before that the Porsche seems to be the opposite of the Supra. While the Supra is actually pretty much good at absolutely everything, it's not quite as nimble as the Porsche, and it does of course have the massive power. The Porsche, however, has incredible acceleration, and if you can get the tires hooked up on any of these slow corners, then you have a huge advantage. The Porsche's main weakness is the overall power and the top speed, so if you don't get a great exit and there's a Supra on your tail, chances are it's going to be very easy for it to pass you before any upcoming corner. Turn 2 and Turn 3 seem to be really, really good places to overtake with the Porsche, because even if you're on the inside and you have kind of a compromised line, the Porsche can rotate really, really well and still have a lot of grip to get out of the corner. Finally, as you can see, the Porsche also has really fantastic brakes. I made a little bit of contact with our buddy Bonester there, but I think it didn't really affect either of our lines, and I didn't have anywhere else to go. I would have hit the curb if I didn't hit him, and I think I actually would have bounced into him and made it much worse. Not to be deterred though, I am very confident in my ability to brake with this car and get it to rotate. As you can see, we rotated. We gave him space too, but unfortunately, it didn't look like the Supra behind us gave him space, and unfortunately, he got pushed off. I just said unfortunately twice in that sentence. I hate when I do that. Continuing the topic of the Porsche not having a ton of power, as long as you stay in slipstream, then it really isn't an issue. But of course, staying in slipstream can be tricky depending on how you pass people or go for passes on people. As with many races, this is the kind of race where there is a required pit stop, but you are not required to take any kind of tire compounds, and there is only one tire compound. Since it is the softs, they do wear out pretty quickly, so it's definitely a good idea to take tires. I think if you're very, very good on tire preservation, then you might be able to do it without taking tires, but it's going to be a very, very risky strat. As you can see by that final sector, the Porsche is also very fantastic in that final sector. So if you do have someone on your tail, you're most likely going to be able to get away from them before they can pass you before turn 1, and you should be able to carry a lot of speed through turn 1, even if you're passing someone, just like that. This car really is fantastic in a battle. For optimal performance, I would suggest anywhere between lap 4 and 6 to go in and change tires, but I do think it's possible to stretch it to 3 or 7 and still have pretty good pace and not be too worried about the sketchiness of the car. The Porsche definitely can get sketchy, and that's actually what causes it to be nimble, or I should say the fact that it's nimble means that it can be sketchy at times. And while it can be exacerbated by having pretty bad tire wear, it's not as scary as you might think when you get used to it. So I do suggest spending a lot of time with this car before writing it off. I don't think you're going to write it off actually in the first place. Most people use this car. I believe this is the most signed up for manufacturer when it comes to the manufacturer series, and it's definitely the most used car that I ever see in the daily races. But since it's no Supra, it's at a disadvantage this week. I have a feeling that a lot of you have probably used this car though. It's fantastic. If you watched my channel before, you've probably heard me talk about the strategy of waiting to actually make a pass. A lot of people make the mistake of trying to pass just anytime they want. For instance, if I were to pass Dragon Force right now, if I went for a move on him, I wasn't going to be next to him until right before the next turn, if at all. And in fact, he had slipstream, so maybe not at all. But if I try to force a move, if I try to go for a dive, I am confident that I'd be able to pull it off, but it would probably slow both of us down enough that we'd probably still be next to each other after the corner, and then one of us would have the slipstream, and it would just end up wasting time. We might even lose slipstream because of that. So with this car, I like to make sure that I wait for T2 that's upcoming or T3. T2 because it's really difficult for most cars and most people, to be quite honest. So I very much encourage you to try to practice coming out of that corner. It's a very important corner. As you can see, all three of those guys messed it up, and I just gained 3 positions in a single corner. Going for moves right there is definitely recommended with this car. I'm not sure if I went for any more in this race particularly, but this corner right here, turn 3, is also my other favorite place to pass because the Porsche really shines for the entirety of the rest of the track after that corner. So if you pass someone, especially if it's not a Porsche, they're probably going to have trouble keeping up with you, let alone giving you any kind of trouble. Perhaps the most important strategy with this track is avoiding penalties. I don't think I've ever done a race here where I haven't gotten at the very least 1 penalty, and I think I averaged 2 or 3. Unfortunately, you won't find out if you have a penalty until you go under that banner, and it is aggravating. I don't know why they do it. Formula 1 drivers mess it up too, so don't feel bad if you end up with penalties here. It's gonna happen. Just be prepared. If I did have to get a penalty, this was actually the very best time for me to get it, because if I serve it right before going to the pits, it kind of minimizes the effect that it has. I don't have to worry about losing my momentum on the last sector, and so I just go into the pits, and I still do lose some time, but it's not nearly as bad as it could be. And like I mentioned earlier, that last corner, actually the last 2 corners are my favorite places to pass. There were 3 Supras battling it out, and because turn 2 was so difficult, 2 of them completely lost their momentum, and Voodoo MGK was still close enough that I could start trying to attack him, which I did right here when he made that mistake. Despite having that very compromised corner entry, I was able to rotate the car, get back on that throttle, balance it out, and I was still all the way in front of our friend Voodoo. If you have anyone even remotely close to you, behind you, make sure you move over and or signal that you're going to go in the pits, because if you go wide and go into it, you have to slow down a lot on the actual racing line, and people will hit you, and it will be a racing incident at best, but really it's probably going to be considered your fault. I also hope you watched how I entered the pits. Feel free to rewind it and watch that again. It's important to really attack the pits. You do save, or I should say gain time. Well, you gain an advantage by really attacking the pits, especially against people who are not attacking the pits. You want to go in as fast as you possibly can. Now, since of course I did have that penalty, serving it then and then going right in the pits is a benefit, like I said, but also that one Supra was right in front of us. So as long as I get a really good outlap, I should be in front of him, and it should be pretty easy to defend against him. And hopefully we'll actually catch other people at the end of the pit cycle too. So all in all, it ended up being pretty beneficial getting that penalty there. I keep saying it's beneficial. It's not beneficial ever getting a penalty, but the best thing you can do is go into the pits right after serving it. And of course, I hope you don't get any more. Before I went into the pits, I was actually in 4th place because I did lose a position to Ronnie while serving that penalty, but I didn't realize everyone was going to pit on lap 6. So I went in 2 laps earlier, had nothing but clean air the entire time, and came out all the way in 2nd place. Some things that I want to note about the opponents: the person behind us was in pole position at the beginning of the race. He had the fastest qualifying time, and his qualifying time was 1:27.1. Now, there are some massive differences between what you can do in time trial versus what you can do consistently over a race. And so it's not always going to translate directly to the same pace that you have during the race, but you can usually guess within reason what a person should be able to do. So when you pay attention to the lap times, I want you to note that USA Hispano had a qualifying time of a 1:27.1 when it comes to just the time trial. And you'll see as I go on what type of delta he's maintaining behind me, what kind of consistency he has. I can't stress enough that this is not meant to be a hit on USA Hispano. Rather, it's to show how good the Porsche is consistently during the race compared to how bad I think it performs in the time trial. At this point, my tires are now 2 laps old and his are brand new. He was at 0.9 seconds behind when he came out of the pits, and right now we're at 1.2 seconds. This is also my very first time driving the Porsche in the race itself. There's definitely a lot more pace to be extracted from this car for pretty much anyone. The guy in the lead, I believe, pit on lap 5, and he's in the Genesis X. So he's in the Jenny, and he has tires that are 1 lap newer than mine. His qualifying time was a 1:27.2. So of course, just keep these in mind when you pay attention to the consistent pace these guys have compared to the Porsche on older tires. And it's also important to note that Only at times does Hispano have any kind of slipstream, but he doesn't have slipstream the entire time. One lap later, and I've gained about 8/10 on the Genesis in front, and the Supra is just about the exact same distance as the last lap. Lap 10, something has happened with the Genesis. We're now only 1.5 seconds away from him, and we are a little bit more than 1.5 seconds away from the Supra now. And in the same place on the final lap, we are still about the same distance away from the Genesis. It looks like he was really trying, and I have to admit, I definitely made a few mistakes in the previous laps. USA Hispano, who is in the Supra, is now a full 2 seconds behind. At this point, you can definitely see that the Genesis is suffering from the tire wear just a little bit more, and the Supra is way back there. I do think that the Supra has a bit more capability than that. I think he probably just made some mistakes, but I, of course, also made some mistakes, and I also started way at the end. I was in the back when this race started. Jumping back, I just saw that I actually started in 13th place, so you can only imagine what we could have done if we actually qualified and started towards the front. With my qualifying time, I would have been in pole position, and I definitely think that I would have been able to carry the same pace and run away with this race. I think it probably would have been a battle because both the Genesis and the Supra behind would have slipstream, but I would also have the benefit of having this consistent pace as well as being able to pull off the same defense and attacks that I've shown you in the video. So there you go. That's why the Porsche, I think, is a fantastic anti-meta car. Thank you for watching my guide. If you liked what you saw, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next week. To finish, I'm going to leave you with a look at my current members. I love every one of you. Thank you very much.